Hey there. Let me tell you about what I've been up to this week. In particular, on the weekend, I met with my prospective advisor, and she gave me some options for research projects, and I'm able to start doing reading towards that. In addition, I went to a very interesting lecture this week on noncommutative geometry, which I want to tell you a bit about. And finally, I am working on the next episode in my noncommutative algebra series on semi-simple modules. So talk a bit about that, because I was able to get this book, Noncommutative Algebra by Farb and Dennis, for participating in the university open house. I was on the Q&A panel as a representative for a first-year graduate student, and there are a bunch of prospective graduate students asking us questions. And everyone who participated in the open house got a book. So first of all, let me learn you a bit about what kind of math I've been thinking about for research. So the idea is called field patching. It's kind of similar to the descent situation that I described in a previous vlog, but it's a bit different. The idea is that in the geometric context, suppose that we have two open sets, U1 and U2. All right, so say you have some space X and you have two sets that cover it. And suppose that you have some object V1 here and V2 here associated to each of these, and you have some data about how these two objects agree on overlaps. So on this intersection U1 and U2. Now the question is, can you glue or patch these two objects into a big object that's defined on all of X? So for example, there's the pasting lemma, it's sometimes called, in topology, where if I have two functions, say I have two functions f1 and f2 that are continuous, and then I know that on overlaps, f1 agrees with f2. So this is also true for closed sets in this situation. So basically I have two functions that agree on overlaps, then I can glue them or paste them together into a big function on the entire space. So this is the geometric picture, and there is a strong association between the algebraic picture that I'm going to describe now to this geometric picture, but it's a little bit complex. There's a little bit of technical detail. It's the geometric picture. So the algebraic picture is what I'm interested in. So suppose that I have two fields. It's what's called field patching, but actually we can do it over more general objects as well. Suppose I have two fields, and they are both contained in some larger field. Yeah, so they are contained in a larger field, and then I have F, which is the intersection of F1 and F2. And so in the correspondence between the geometric and algebraic pictures, the idea is that these fields are going to correspond to these sets. This bigger field is going to correspond to this intersection, and the intersection here is actually going to correspond to the union here. So it's a bit weird because it goes backwards, like intersection becomes union, but that's the way that it usually happens when you translate from algebra to geometry. So suppose that I have some objects, V1 and V2. Here, I'm going to take them to be vector spaces. It's true for more general objects as well, but say that I have these vector spaces here, and then I know that if I extend them, so there's this notion where if I have one field, phone says there's community crime. So there's this notion of extending when you have one field containers of another, extending an object to an object here. So this is going to be the tensor product. Yeah, let's call this V1 F0. So we have some way of extending. Here it's by the tensor product, if you know what that is. If not, doesn't matter. And we have some way of extending V2. And now in the algebraic picture, this agreeing on intersections thing is going to correspond to a choice of isomorphism from this space to this space. Because here we don't really have a notion of, being equal in intersections. We need to correspond how we translate from here to here. So actually, these things, if this and this have the same dimension, these things will always be isomorphic. The question is, in what way they are isomorphic? And so if we have this data, the question is, when can we get a space V, which is over this field F, such that when we extend to here and to here, so when we extend V to be over F1, and when we extend V to be over F2, it's isomorphic to the objects we started with. So in some sense, V here corresponds to the big object here, and this extension corresponds in some way to a restriction, right? So basically this function f satisfies that on U1, it's equal to F1, and on U2, it's equal to F2. So that corresponds to this extension, and instead of being equal, we just ask for it to be isomorphic. So that's the idea of patching. There's a lot of cool applications to this. There's a way to do the inverse Galois problem, constructing Galois extensions of fields using this. Very, very cool idea. So I basically have two options of where I want to go with this project. One of them is trying to show that there is this patching setup, which can be made more general. So showing that it occurs in some certain way for a certain class of nicely behaved rings, which is going to generalize some results that my prospective advisor and collaborators did. The other one is asking, which I think I'm probably going to go with, but we'll see, is asking about how this patching process interacts with algebraic invariance. So you can show, for example, that the Brouwer group of a field where this patching situation happens is in some way constructed from the Brouwer groups of the bigger fields. So this is what is called the fiber product. So you can show that there is this relationship. So the question that I'm tasked with is understanding if this is true for rings in algebraic K-theory. So the case for K0 is already known, but for higher K-theory, that's not known. But basically, this shows you how this theory of patching interacts with algebraic invariance of fields and rings. So that's about my research. Now, about the course. So I got this book. It's basically the gospel for noncommutative algebra. It describes the first course and some further topics. There are other books that I really like. For example, First Course in Noncommutative Rings by Lamb. It does a few more things, but this is really the core theory that you're going to start from. So let me show you the contents. So this is the basically there's a sort of quick review of prerequisite material as well as exercises to get you going. Then you have the core course about semi-simple modules, what about Artin, Jacobson radical, and Brouwer theory, and then some extra choice topics. So, of course, there's a lot that can be covered in a non-commutative algebra course, but this is really the core material that you need to know, plus some extra nice choice topics. So we had this really cool lecture about non-commutative algebraic geometry. So basically the idea is, I'm going to have to explain a bit of algebraic geometry, but basically the idea is that for a ring, which is some algebraic object, we can associate a thing called the spectrum of that ring. This is a topological space. It's a certain type of topological space called an affine scheme. And it turns out that these two things are actually equivalent. If we know the spectrum, if we know an affine scheme, we can go back and get the ring. This is a duality of categories, but this is only true for commutative rings. So the question is, okay, what if I want R to be non-commutative? So you might think, if you know how to define the spectrum, there's some naive things you can try, but actually there is this paper by Manuel Reyes, which says that there is no way to do this. If you try and generalize this spec in a way that agrees with how it works on commutative rings. If you take the spectrum of, for example, 3x3 matrices over C, this is going to be empty. It's going to be the empty set, which doesn't make sense. There should be like points in this. So any way you try, this is going to happen. There's some technical reasons why that's true. Such a functor has to respect certain types of colimits, and if it respects too many colimits, then this type of degeneration happens. So defining non-commutative algebraic geometry is hard, because all the objects that algebraic geometrists care about come from taking these affine schemes and gluing them together in some way. So there are a lot of ways to do non-commutative geometry, but all of them have the same basic idea. So the idea is this. It's basically, say I have X, which is a scheme. So scheme, it doesn't matter what it is. It's a geometric object. Now I can associate something to this scheme. So associate some object. Let's say it's called Q of X. So this is some object. The type of object this can be. So for example, this can be a category. It can be a functor. It can be an algebraic object. So it can be any of these things. But so this scheme has some rings associated to it, and they are commutative. And now we take this thing, we try and generalize to non-commutative rings. So we get something, which this doesn't actually come from an object X, but it in some way is a non-commutative version. So let me give an example of what I mean. And this is the thing that was discussed in the talk. So the idea is this, for a scheme, so for a projective scheme. So I'm not going to get into what exactly that is, but basically it has to do with a ring. So you have X, and this in some way corresponds to some ring A. In this case, it's going to be a graded ring. The same way that an affine scheme corresponds to a regular ring, a commutative ring, this is going to be a graded commutative ring. So from here, we have the category of quasi-coherent sheaves over X. I'm not going to get into what that is, but it's a category that is associated to X and actually determines X. If the quasi-coherent sheaf category of X and Y are equivalent, then X and Y themselves are isomorphic. So this actually is isomorphic to something that depends on A. So I'm not going to explain what this is, but this is a thing that depends on A. Now, the nice thing is that actually in the projective case, there can be a lot of rings that associate to X. This thing doesn't actually depend on the specific ring A. It just depends on X. So now we can extend this to non-commutative things, because this definition doesn't require our ring to be commutative. So now we can take, let's say, some R, which is non-commutative, and then we can define the quasi-coherent sheaves on proj R to be this category. So this thing. So now we can actually try and do geometry on this thing. Now, the nice thing about these kinds of correspondences is that a lot of the geometric properties of this space are reflected in this category. So we can try and understand what kind of geometric properties this thing has. Now, the tricky thing is that this object inside doesn't really exist. So we don't know what it should be, but we know if it exists, then its category of quasi-coherent sheaves should be like this. But, as I said, a lot of the properties, geometric properties of X are reflected here. So we can, in some sense, understand the geometry of this object, if it existed, by looking at this object. So, for example, if we have points here, so in a sense, a scheme has a lot of points, but some of them don't correspond to actual geometry, but they correspond to something a little bit more fuzzy. That's a little bit weird, but inside of those, there are the geometric points, and those are the actual points. So points here actually correspond to something here. Well, in fact, here, which is called point modules. So we can try and understand the geometry of this maybe non-existent object by studying the point modules here, because the definition carries over to the non-commutative case. And so we get a way to reason about a geometric object, which maybe doesn't exist, but does tell us something about a ring. So we can use techniques from algebraic geometry, which work in this context, to study algebra. So I think that's really cool. And there are a lot of ways to do this. There are also non-commutative geometry in the C-star algebra sense, which is also very cool. I might do a video on the Gelfand-Naimark theorem in the future, which has to do with that. It's very cool. But yeah, that is a little bit of non-commutative geometry. Maybe as a final comment, there is actually work that uses this construction to classify a certain type of ring. And it uses these geometric properties to study the actual algebraic structures of the rings themselves. So that's all the things that I wanted to talk about today. I'm very excited to continue reading about patching over fields and being able to talk about and delve deeper into that subject and being able to actually start doing research. So I will definitely be talking more about that in the near future. But for now, I'll see you soon in the second episode of the Non-Commutative Algebra series and otherwise in these vlogs. So take care, go do some cool math, and I'll see you next time.